welcome Magic players to the latest in everything about Vintage. My name is Justin. I'm actually level 1. I'm a part-time Vintage streamer, multiple Vintage PTQ winner, and Vintage Showcase champion. And what I'm going to do is get you caught up on what Vintage looks like right now in July of 2022 ahead of the Mana Trader series that is happening this month. What I'm going to do is go through each deck that you're likely to see, maybe some decks you're unlikely to see, and just explain how they work a little bit and what they're like, what their position in the metagame is like. These videos tend to run a bit long. I'm going to try to add timestamps, and feel free to jump around to parts that interest you. But these do tend to run a little long, so I'm going to get right going, and I'm probably going to talk on the faster side. So, the basic overview of Vintage is you have multiple pillars. You have Mishra's Workshop, a land that taps for 3 artifact mana, making a pillar that has some aggro, some control, and some combo elements in it. You have Bazaar of Baghdad, tap, draw 2, discard 3, fueling a set of 3 graveyard decks that all interact with the format in different ways in Dredge, Hogak, and Squee. And then you have blue decks. Ancestral Recall lets you do a lot of different things in Magic and is paired with all types of different colors. You can be comboing, you can be control, you could be playing creatures. Basically anything you ever wanted to do, Ancestral Recall lets you do that. And then you have a various smattering of other decks that, fall from the blue branch. So you have a graveyard set of decks, a colorless set of decks, a blue set of decks, and the blue deck is obviously a very wide range of things. But there are, of course, other elements of the format. There are some various aggro decks, both blue and non-blue. There are some mid-ranging creature decks. There are some combo/control decks based around Oath of Druids, which is only really legal in Vintage. So there's a lot of things that can happen and will happen in terms of deck building in Vintage. We're just going to go right through the list and pick out some decks. I'll show you, a list, and I'll tell you how it works. First, we're going to go and talk about workshop decks. There's only really one workshop deck being played in large numbers right now. What you're looking at, I should probably mention beforehand, is the Vintage online metagame data collected by the community. We have a great Discord full of wonderful people who like to play and talk about Vintage, and a few who are very dedicated and help me put together deck lists or deck choices for all the players in the Vintage challenges, and then we record them and put them into this sheet. So right now I'm just looking at the last 135 days of Magic Online data to show you what the metagame currently looks like, what's being played, and how well it's doing. Currently, the main workshop variant is Aggro Shops. Aggro Shops is very similar to something like Affinity in Modern. It is a, artifact-based creature deck, but it gets to use Sphere of Resistance and Phyrexian Revoker and some other lock pieces that are restricted, like Trinisphere and Thorn of Amethyst, to make a aggro deck that has some resistance against combo elements in the format. One of the main recipients of Urza Saga are these decks, very reliant on good wastelands. But basically, yeah, an aggro prison style deck that is going to put some big threats into play and lock your opponent out of playing spells. These decks haven't been doing as well lately. They are supposed to be historically good against like fairer blue control decks, but those don't exist in a huge number right now. They're supposed to be good against the more combo oriented elements of the format. However, combo has gained a lot of pieces, but Aggro Shops and the other shops decks have kind of, they were very, very, very good, too good for a long number of years, so they got a bunch of pieces restricted, and as they got pieces restricted, new cards came out for the other decks, and they haven't exactly caught up. Now, these decks are not unplayable by any means. They're a totally playable choice, but they are, they're not doing super well right now. There are a couple other variants of workshops. Some use Golos, the banned EDH card, to make a more prison-oriented deck. You're going to tutor up more lock pieces. You're going to try to make sure that your opponent can't cast any spells. Use like Crucible Wasteland, Crucible Stripmine, that kind of thing. And then there's some more combo-oriented lists, things like KCI, or decks that use Coveted Jewel to draw their whole deck. Those decks exist, but they're not, primary choices for the field. That's our workshop pillar. We're going to dive into our Bazaar pillar right now. And now I will have to go into each of the different Bazaar decks because not only are they very widely played, but they are also fairly strong. The most, the historically the most played Bazaar deck would actually be Dredge. That's not the case at the moment. This is a historically strong deck. You are mulliganing to your Bazaar of Baghdad. You need to have Bazaar of Baghdad in your opening hand. And you're basically using the broken dredge mechanic. Where is the broken dredge mechanic? To replace your draw steps, putting a bunch of other dredgers in your yard, returning prized amalgams and narcomoebas, casting free griefs, returning Icarids, casting free hollow ones, backed up by a pile of forces, vigors, wills, negations, sometimes mindbreak traps, sometimes noxious revivals, as well as creeping chill. Basically, you're not going to pay any mana for any spells. You're going to tap Bazaar, and you're going to throw your whole deck into your graveyard over the next 2 turns as your opponent watches in horror and dies. This deck is typically very good against, it used to, well, there's a lot of things that have changed recently. But anytime where you're putting a clock on your opponent and you have access to Force of Will, you're going to, any kind of matchup like that is going to be good. However, if your opponent, has Wasteland, gets rid of your Bazaar, maybe exiles your graveyard too many times, it can be pretty challenging. This is a deck that is extremely weak to hate in comparison to some of the other graveyard-based decks, because you truly are, a Mold the Bazaar, use your graveyard type of deck. You don't have super strong plan Bs. You can obviously put in some free hollow ones and back them up with Force of Will. That's a thing that can happen, but it's not as strong as your plan A. The most played graveyard deck right now is actually the most versatile deck out of the Bazaar category, and that's Hogak. A similar deck to something you've seen banned in Modern and played slightly in Legacy. This deck has Bazaar of Baghdad, but doesn't have to mulligan to it. It can totally play a fair Bayou strategy, but you don't really want to play the fair Bayou strategy unless you have maybe a turn 1 or turn 2 Hogak off of things like Stitcher Supplier. Basically, this deck is going to, use free hollow ones, free root wallas of multiple varieties to trigger Vengevine to play early Hogaks and return Bloodghasts. It does get to play other lands though, so you can do things like play Deathrite Shaman and use that very powerful card to do all kinds of things. It's got many abilities on it. This is a deck that is really liked by new players to the format. It's also a deck that is very well documented. You'll find that vintage deck lists don't typically have a lot of content behind them. The reason is, for content creators in vintage, there's not a lot to gain. The views are small, the audience is small. There's really no websites or anything looking for content, so you don't typically find a lot of vintage content on the web. This deck, however, has the creator, No Props, has a sideboard guide. You can find the link to that in the Discord. I'll make sure I put a link to all my links in the description of this video. But if you can go to there, you can find actually this whole metagame sheet is public information. You can take a copy of this metagame sheet, play around with it. But there's also a link to the Discord, which is pretty much the biggest place on the web to talk about vintage with other people who play the format. In the pins of the Bazaar section, we have a link to No Props' sideboard guide. There's also a ton of VODs of this deck being played. I played this deck a bunch of times in testing, so I have videos. You can also find videos from better pilots. Montolio, Andy Marketing has a bunch of videos. There's a lot of content out there on learning how to play this deck specifically, which makes it kind of a front runner for newer players. Expect to see this deck played a lot. It's currently one, if not the most played deck in the format, and also one of the strongest decks in the format. So you need to be ready and have game plans for Hogak, or maybe even be playing it yourself. This kind of deck struggles versus combo. All the combo decks have a pretty reasonable matchup against it because you don't really have the greatest choices in terms of ways to beat combo because you're playing Jund. So you end up with like Archive Trap to beat Doomsday, Mindbreak Trap to beat Tinker-based decks. You have Collector Roost and Pyroblast, but they are all like not the strongest answers to those kind of decks. So good against non-combo, bad against combo. This is actually a deck that's quite good against other Bazaar decks as well. It's quite good against Shops decks and creature decks. It's just very much a very overwhelming creature strategy. The final deck that is being played for Bazaar players is Squee. sometimes known as Hollowvine, sometimes known as Squee Hollowvine, apparently. I like that. This is actually a really interesting deck because it almost plays like Blue-Red Delver in Legacy, but it is still a Bazaar Baghdad deck. So it is a mulligan to Bazaar deck. So you have 4 Bazaar, 4 Serum Powder. You need a Bazaar for this deck to function. You have to mulligan and find this card, or your deck doesn't work. However, once you find this card, your life gets pretty easy as you pitch Master of Deaths and Squeeze to these things will return from your graveyard on your upkeep, and it will offset the card disadvantage of Bazaar, sometimes turning it into a Faithless Looting, sometimes even drawing you extra cards every turn. Obviously, same idea where we use Hollow Ones and Root Wallas to return Vengevines, and then we're packing every free counterspell you could possibly imagine all in one deck. So you kind of jam a Hollow One and maybe some Lizard Friends, and then you draw a bunch of counters and you keep it in play and win the game. Kind of like a Delver strategy, but again, you spend no mana on any of your things because, well, this is Vintage. This is what you do. This kind of deck is very good against combo and blue decks that don't play Wasteland. This deck is extremely weak to other players who play Wasteland because your deck entirely revolves around Bazaar of Baghdad. If you lose your Bazaar of Baghdad engine, you have a hard time winning unless you're, already have a very large fleet of free creatures. And that's our two, non-blue pillars with Shops and Bazaar. I will briefly touch into Control, but we're not going to go look at any lists. Control was a deck that, specifically Jeskai Control, was a deck that dominated the format for many years. Some restrictions on things like Gush, as well as the rise of cards that are good against Jeskai, like Saga, Hollow One. These kind of things have pushed Control decks to reimagine themselves. You'll see that there's a blue-red tempo Murktide deck. There's a blue-white tempo Stoneblade deck. There's some Deathrite Shaman Luris decks, and that's kind of where the Control decks have pushed themselves out to. Because Control had a kind of a hard time adapting to Urza's Saga, those decks have kind of transformed into decks that are more capable of dealing with the current metagame. So it's very unlikely for you to pair against something like a Jeskai deck or a Rug deck or a Standstill deck or something like that. But they do exist, and you can find them on the web if you are interested in those kind of decks. When we go talk about combo, and we're going to talk about combo in two places, really. We're going to talk about combo that are not Tinker dedicated, and then combos that are Tinker dedicated. When we don't talk about the Tinker combo decks, when we talk about the non-Tinker combo decks that are, well, the non-dedicated Tinker combo decks, I should say, because Breach can play Tinker. There are two main standouts with Doomsday and Breach. Doomsday is probably the premier combo deck of the format. It is not as hard to play as it used to be. Doomsday used to be one of the hardest decks to play in Magic, and now with the printing of Thassa's Oracle, this deck has become still extremely powerful, but the floor has been raised quite a lot. The basic pile for this deck is fairly easy. You just have Ancestral or Gush into Lotus and Thassa's Oracle, and you win. Now, obviously, the deck is much more complicated than that, especially when people start playing, answers and spells that restrict your ability to make a normal pile. But there are definitely Doomsday resources on the internet. Eric has a Doomsday guide he just put out. One of the Zoomers made a Doomsday guide a while back. There's content from some of the Japanese experts on the deck. So that you can find information out there on how to play this deck. There are definitely VODs from Canister and Reed Duke, which are both extremely powerful wizards, if you want to check that out. Basically, a Dark Ritual combo deck where turn 1 you cast Dark Ritual Doomsday, make your pile, and sometimes win the game on turn 1. I would say most of the time you're averaging turn 2 kills, and you also pack the most counters of any deck in the format. You're playing 4 Fluster, 5 Force, you got some Dazes in there. This deck is extremely powerful and extremely scary, and definitely one of the better choices coming into this month's event. The other combo deck is Underworld Breach, and you're going to find multiple ways to build this deck. Currently, it feels like the best way to build it is to include Tinker, but right now you're even looking at a deck that doesn't have Tinker in it at all. So that's what I'm saying. When you come across Breach, there's really no defined way to play this deck. Right now, I'm looking at a Clone 9 top 8 list, but this one is using Underworld Breach in combination with Brain Freeze and Black Lotus. to mill yourself out, and then mill out your opponent and cast Ancestral targeting them. However, there's a lot of other things going on in this kind of deck. You have Sagas, you can make some tokens, you can tutor up your Black Lotus, you can play a very fair game using Expressive Iteration and Ragavan, sometimes even Dreadhorde Arcanist, or a Lelia commander card right here. This is not the only way to build it. Let's see if we can find another one. I think a more common thing to see, well, this is another way to build it that is not a more common thing to see. So this is a Lurrus-based version of Breach that uses Dragon Rage Channeler. I was hoping to find a Tinker version. Maybe that's in a different category. It's possible that's in a different category. If I were to go to Tinker, maybe, and then try to find one that has Breach in it. Aha, yes. Here is a version that is probably the most popular version of Breach, where you play a hybrid deck between Tinker for Bola Citadel and Underworld Breach combo. So this gives you a powerful threat with Tinker into Citadel or Tinker into Sphinx, sometimes Tinker into Blightsteel, depending on the metagame. But you're still doing the whole Breach plus Brain Freeze and Black Lotus or Lotus Petal combo. So basically you get a couple extra options and when you build your deck this way. So Underworld Breach is a deck that is being played in fairly large numbers and performing very well. Obviously, you can choose a couple different ways to build it as well, which is really interesting. Something to keep an eye out on when you play this kind of deck is when you build it, you have to realize what kind of hate you're signing yourself up for, right? If you play a version that is more dedicated to artifacts, you have to be wary of things like Collector Roof. If you play a version that is dedicated to Lurrus, you might have to be very wary of things like Leyline of the Void. And then when you play like the first version we saw, that's kind of the more normal not normal, but more balanced, not balanced. It has it's not as weak to hate as the other versions because you're playing kind of a game that is not too dedicated on the graveyard, not too dedicated on artifacts, more just dedicated to playing creatures on the board. So just gotta be aware of like what you're signing yourself up for with each version of Breach that you register. We've talked a lot about kind of things that hinge on more combo elements, but Vintage is definitely a format where it's very high power, and even the fair decks are playing some kind of combo element in them. Here we have players in the Deathrite Shaman category who are playing as fair as you can really get. These are kind of mid-ranging, controlling shells, and we do have a couple ways to build Deathrite Shaman decks right now as well. This is a more classic example of a Deathrite Shaman deck. It is a Oko deck. It is a use my Deathrite Shaman to power out, a turn 2 Collector Roof plus Wasteland or a turn 2 Oko. Use some counter spells to make sure I don't die to combo, and then grind my opponent out with things like Wasteland and Oof and Tarmogoyf and Leovold. This is a very kind of a similar deck idea to a Legacy deck, but it's viable. It's a thing that you can do in Vintage. It's a thing that historically can be very good when the format is shops and graveyard based. Like if there are a lot more shops and graveyards decks, these kind of decks do seem to do pretty well into that kind of metagame. Currently, they've been struggling a little bit, but still something that is going to show up in numbers. It's definitely something that is being played, and it's a very easy deck for players from like Legacy to transition into. This is not an unfamiliar strategy. You are doing a lot of similar gameplay and deck building ideas as something like a Legacy mid-range deck. There are other ways to build the Deathrite Shaman decks. You can splash red in this deck and play a more Planeswalker based deck. So you would play red and 6, Dak Faden, Oko, and Narset, sometimes as high as 10 Planeswalkers that we typically call 4-color Deathrite Shaman walkers. And there's another one which has been really popular lately and also putting up pretty strong results, and those are the Lurrus Deathrite Shaman decks. So these decks forego the things that cost 3 mana, like Oko, and instead focus on a bit more in the spell categories with Force of Will and Force of Vigor, and then a bit more into the lands idea, where you're playing things like Elvish Reclaimer, Urza's Saga, Beseiju, and you're trying to use the power of lands to grind out your lock and your advantages. Sometimes these decks do play Standstill, can be pretty interesting with Lurrus, can be pretty interesting with Saga, maybe a way for you to, try to get your opponent to not combo kill you. These decks are, built in a variety of ways right now. This one, for example, is splashing 3 red and 6. Yes, I said splashing 3 red and 6 because this deck is 5 colors. Oh, yeah, white, black, green, red, blue. Obviously, lots of blue. These decks are very dependent on Deathrite Shaman not dying. But when Deathrite Shaman doesn't die, you have access to all your spells, and you are doing powerful things. So definitely check out some of these lists. There's some interesting things going on. These are decks you're going to see because players definitely gravitate towards this. This is like probably one of the more controlling decks in the format right now, somewhere between mid-range and control. And it's definitely a deck where people are, interested in the idea and the play patterns. And it's definitely a deck that has play patterns similar to like older legacy formats. Things like Ren and 6 and Deathrite Shaman. People have reps with those cards in other formats. So definitely something to keep an eye out. And a deck that is like performing at the peak right now of decks that do have, significant play numbers. Vintage isn't all combo and blue. There are aggro decks. They don't do super well. Even the blue-based aggro decks don't do super well. But it's worth noting, some players don't have incredibly large budget, and this kind of deck is extremely cheap. So you're likely to see it, if someone has, someone wants to play it. It's not a deck that's never done well. For example, I would always check out lists by Grim. Grim is a player who put up something like a 60-something% win rate in vintage challenges with this deck. So there are, there's evidence of players doing well with this deck. However, in general, on like a larger scale, it has been performing very poorly. Basically, this is just a white weenie deck, a Death and Taxes deck. You are going to use like very pointed hate pieces for the format with Arbiter and Kataki backed up, and Spirit of the Labyrinth backed up by the power of Luminarch Aspirant to make your clock significant. This card is very good. I've always been very impressed with Lumi. And then you're going to, keep your opponent from killing you with Deafening Silences and Spirit of the Labyrinth and stuff like that. So it is a deck that definitely grinds due to Luris, but it is, I would say, objectively less powerful than other decks. But if you hit the metagame right, you open a hand that has, a Kataki against an all-artifact hand, like there's definitely some power here. And it's a deck I've obviously lost to a fair bit on stream. So you can definitely, you can see where this deck might, have a very strong position. If you lead off with like Black Lotus, Thalia, Spirit of the Labyrinth, it's gonna be very hard for a combo deck to win. Vintage decks don't play a lot of removal, especially vintage combo decks. So you end up with kind of exploiting a metagame hole where, because they're not playing a lot of creature removal, you can get away with playing a bunch of creatures and then make a combo player's life very sad. You do get to play a bunch of Wastelands as well, which can definitely help in terms of, the Bazaar matchups, things like that. Karakas in the main to bounce Hogak is pretty powerful, so something to keep an eye on, especially because I think it's a deck you're likely to see just due to its price tag. The only other like prominently played blue aggro / tempo deck is this Murktide deck. It looks exactly like you would think a blue-red Murktide deck from like Legacy would look like. You have Ragavans, Murktides, Expressive Iterations, and a pile of blue and red cards. I don't have a very high opinion of this deck, but it is a deck that is played quite a lot and a deck that has done some amount of winning. Overall, currently not a super strong deck, but a deck that has put plenty of people, into winning positions, especially players like Mogged. Here's a top 8 with Izzet down here. I don't know how well like these cards really line up in Vintage. I have some issues with Ragavan in the format in the terms of I don't think it's super strong. Like, it's very hard to play this card against the amount of creatures that are being played right now. It's not super great to play this card against Bazaar, especially against Bazaar. So I'm not exactly sure, like, where, like, there's no control deck, right, where this card would shine a lot. And the more mid-ranging and control variants of the format all play lots of creatures. So I'm not sure exactly where this deck is getting its power from. Obviously, Murktide Regent can be very good, but it's also a card that gets hit by the main deck Pyroblast in the format. So there are some issues there as well. So definitely a deck to keep in mind. It's a very popular deck because I believe people see it, they know how good it is in Legacy, so they try to port it into Vintage and then have some amount of success. So a deck to keep an eye on. There are obviously other aggro decks in the format. There's like a green-white deck that uses Archon of Emeria and Stoneforge Mystic. There's a Bant version of the Archon deck. And there's also a blue-white Stoneforge Mystic deck that has actually pretty reasonable results in the hands of a very small number of pilots. So if those things sound like something that might interest you, you can go try to find those on the internet. Definitely things you can look at. I highly recommend the Goldfish's search feature. You go to advanced search, and then you can type in, I want to see vintage decks that were used in tournaments in the last year, and I want to play an Archon of Emeria deck, for example. So you can do search, and then you will find all posted lists that have Archon in them. For example, here you could go to this Wessel list. It says humans, but it is a green-white Thalia Archon deck. So I highly recommend that feature in terms of finding lists that suit you. There are a couple of more things we still need to go through. Let's talk about Oath. Oath is an archetype that sees some amount of play, small amount of play, but it's a very historic vintage deck type. There are many, many, many ways to build Oath of Druids. One of the largest sets of Oath data are from Miharu. She has a rug control Oath deck using Planeswalkers, Pyroblasts, Veil of Summer, Flusterstorm. Basically, you play a very controlling game, and then you jam an Oath and get Niv Mizzet and Griselbrand. You can do other things. Sai has definitely had some interesting takes on Oath. This is kind of a controlling deck, but more of a bug variant, using Pernicious Deed to really hate on Urza's Saga. It's got a Sarah's Emissary, who's very, very, very good against the Bazaar decks, especially Hogak. Hogak doesn't typically have an answer to Sarah's Emissary on creature right now. So if you can get Sarah's Emissary into play somehow, it can be very strong. And this is like a more controlling deck. I don't know if there are any variants in this list that have a more combo-oriented slant to them. I know I tend to put more combo-oriented slants in my Oath list. I don't see any right now. But you can do things like Hullbreaker Horror. You can do things like 2 Griselbrands. You can do things like Underworld Breach, Sun Titan. There's lots of ways to build Oath. In general, Oath is not considered a super strong deck in the metagame anymore, mostly due to Force of Vigor, and also just having to pass the turn. It is a lot right now. The metagame is fast in comparison to previous metagames, and Oath can just be a bit too slow. That being said, people will play it, so you should know it exists and know what it's doing. For those, I guess I never really explained that one. That one I probably should explain. The card Oath of Druids is an enchantment where if you have less if the player who has less creatures on their upkeep, they get to put a creature off the top, flip a creature off the top into play. So basically, you give your opponent a creature with Forbidden Orchard, and then you flip a Griselbrand or a Sarah's Emissary or a Niv Mizzet or something into play for free. So that's what Oath is trying to do. And it definitely has had its time in the sun, but right now I'm not 100% sure it's an Oath metagame. And then last, but certainly not least, the largest metagame percentage of decks is still Blue Tinker decks. Obviously, this metagame percentage has been going down very steadily. For a while in 2022 and 2021, Tinker decks featuring Urza's Saga were the most played and the most winning. But the metagame has adapted, and we're at a spot where that's probably not the case anymore. The most played, there's still most played Tinker decks are these Urza decks. Not Urza the card, more of Urza's Saga as your game plan B. Your plan A is always still Tinker for Bolas' Citadel. That's just broken. But plan B here is use your counter spells and your tutor suite to facilitate making some large constructs and killing your opponent that way. You have access to Manifold Key off of your Urza Saga, giving you infinite turns with Time Vault. You have nice cards like Monastery Mentor, Lavinia if you're in the Esper deck, but you don't have to be Esper. You can be Grixis, you can be Esper, you can be 4-color. You have a lot of flexibility in your 50 through 60th slots in this kind of style of deck, which lets you do some really nice deck building and hit the metagame in unique ways. A lot of these decks, a lot of the players who've been playing these style decks have turned their decks into Underworld Breach Tinker decks, which we showed you earlier. But you can definitely still play a Saga-oriented Tinker deck, even if the metagame has been trending down on them. They're obviously still a deck you're very likely to play against, and a deck that is obviously strong. The second most played Tinker deck is, I think, the strongest Tinker deck, and that's Paradoxical Outcome. a deck that can be blue-black, blue-white, or Esper, or even 4-color. I mean, historically, over the course of PO's lifetime, it's been every color combination. I played green versions as well. Right now, the most common list you're going to see is this Esper list with Saga. I think this is probably the most common version. So you got 4 Sagas, you have some number of repeals, and this is a combo deck that is using Paradoxical Outcome to pick up a bunch of Moxen and then replay just keep playing Paradoxical Outcomes and draw your whole deck. Your plan A is actually still Tinker Citadel because that's broken, but you also have access to 4 Paradoxicals. You have access to Manifold Key Time Vault with your Urza Saga. You have access to whole Monastery Mentor, restricted broken card. Very, very good in this deck. I like to note that this isn't the only way to build Saga. I think this is less powerful than building Saga without, building PO without Saga. This is how I like to build it. I just top 8'd a challenge the other weekend with this deck. But there are pros and cons basically to when you play Saga and when you don't. Saga will obviously help you against a bunch of Pyroblast, but will hurt you against a bunch of Vigors. And then it's up to you to determine if the metagame suits a Pyroblast or a Vigored metagame. But I would say that like if your opponent is on PO, the most likely list is this Esper list from Daphne over here, who has multiple top 8s recently with this deck. So a very well played deck, a very common deck to see. Lots of new players like to play PO because it feels very unique and very vintagey. You're doing a very powerful thing, getting to do a lot of spells, and pretty fun deck in my opinion. But obviously that's just my opinion. Look out for it as it's one of the more winning decks and one of the more played decks. There are obviously a couple other ways you can play Tinker. There's an 8 cast, which is very similar to the Legacy. It might not even be similar to the Legacy version, but basically you're playing Seat of the Synod, Thought Cast, and Thought Monitor in a Tinker shell. That deck sees some amount of play, but not a lot anymore, as players have mostly gravitated toward Breach, Tinker Saga, and PO as their Tinker decks of choice. And that's a pretty quick and easy overview of what's going on in Vintage right now. There are some more pointed pieces of content. You can find them in the Discord, talk to some players, find some more gameplay videos. You're feel free to look on my YouTube channel and search up for a deck of these types. I've played most of the decks in the format at this point. Obviously, I can't guarantee how strong a performance those decks do. Obviously, I'm a much better combo player, so if you're looking for a PO VOD, I think that the most recent PO video I put out with top 8 the challenge is very, very good. One of my better pieces of content with some of my better play. So I would check that link out. You can learn a bunch about PO there. If you want to learn about Hogak, like I said, there's some good links in the Discord. You can find VODs from Canister and Reed for that one. You can find VODs from Canister and Reed for Doomsday as well, I believe. And then I think for some of the more Deathrite Shaman based stuff, Andy Marketin, who we'll have links in the Discord, and I'll have links in the description, has some good videos there. If you're interested in something like Blue White Stoneblade, Senpai Blank has some videos. You can find that inside of the channels in the Discord and links in the description. I hope this is a good overview of what you're going to expect in the format. I hope this will help people jump into the Mana Traders that's starting this month. If you have more questions, feel free to stop in the Discord and ask them. There are plenty of people there who can answer. You can always at me on Twitter or stop by a stream. All of those things are great options. I will be definitely streaming all of my Mana Trader matches that I can. And we'll definitely just do those all live for the audience to see, because that'll be a lot of fun. I will see you in the next one. Good luck in your Mana Traders event.